being a woman is not enough to understand women's oppression, gender hierarchies. It's something you become aware of as life proceeds. Sometimes real life experiences have a way of striking the realities that you face. At times, discourses and discussions at different levels make you start considering the taken for granted aspects of life. And in the course of my own development, I was always raised as a very independent woman and someone expected to stand on her own 2 feet. But this did not necessarily mean a feminist consciousness as such. Being an independent and empowered woman does not necessarily always entail a feminist consciousness. On the contrary, sometimes such women may think it's their own success, and all these other miserable women are miserable because they're not doing anything about it. And this is where the feminist consciousness comes, I think. Then you start seeing the structured inequalities. You may have been fortunate to have a chance within those inequalities. But of course, the internationalization of women's concerns had a great impact on my own thinking. I was a graduate student at Cornell when the first Women's Conference took place. And I was near writing up my dissertation, which I later recognized had no gender perspective at all. You know, I was writing as if there are no women there, and that's how things were written. And in the 70s, I think we became, of course, women's movements go far back, but as an international movement, 70s brought on a lot of realizations, a lot of scholarship came out, excellent work came out, and the World Conference, I think, was a eye-opener. Women's engagement with the UN all the way back in 1945, I think, was a very significant historic moment. Women gained a platform, an international platform, through their engagement with the UN to bring their issues to the international arena. But the UN also transformed with women pushing their agenda. So it was a mutually dynamic and successul engagement. Of course, the story runs very long. We don't have time to go through all that. But initially, this woman's story in the UN reflects very much the emerging consciousness of women's realities. As we all know, it first started with formal equality, because we're talking about a period when women in all countries, most countries, did not have right to vote and be elected, or they were slowly gaining this right with the turn of the century. And then this, as the movement grew, as third worldism became an issue of politics, women's agenda also turned to issues of development. And the woman and development discourse and agenda of the UN, I think, taught us a lot, and it brought in far more diverse women's groups into the movement. I myself, I'm from a development background. I studied development sociology. And so my work initially was with grassroots women, how women can be integrated into development without being marginalized further. But it was interesting that the private lives of women were totally overlooked, even in this very successful and powerful women and development agenda. The emphasis was on basic needs, integrating women's labor into new development agendas, and giving accountability and recognition to women's labor. These were all very, very important agendas, no doubt. But then women being beaten up in her home or being raped in a dark alley, these were often overlooked. And it took a number of years, for decades actually, for the international women's movement to lobby and advocate for recognition of violence as a basic human rights issue. Even as late as the 70s, 79, when the SDO Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, all forms of discrimination against women, was adopted, there was no provision on violence because the international community at that time considered this as a private matter. And these were not countries who have a very tarnished record of violence today. These were, the civilized world, because they simply didn't think that this was something of concern to the international policy and normative agenda. So finally, with persistent work of international women's movement and their collaborators within the UN who worked together, slowly, the issue of violence started gaining a little bit more recognition. First, there were works on violence in the family and more conventional perspectives on violence. But then it became recognized as a human rights violation. And SDO, of course, the committee corrected the lack of focus on this issue in the convention by adopting General Recommendation 19 in 1992. So the significance of this general recommendation is that parties to the SDO Convention now had to report on what they're doing with respect to violence. So it's not part of the core convention, but by way of being a party to the convention, these general recommendations impose obligation on states. So this was a big step forward. And the real moment came with the Vienna Conference. I was not present at the Vienna Conference, but I have read so much about it, and I sort of visualize it as if I was there. Women were extremely visible and active in pushing their agenda, and their collaborators within the UN, remarkable women themselves, helped to put the agenda really firmly on the table. And since then, it has been a growing concern. Of course, in 1994, the Human Rights Council, it was a commission at that time, adopted the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women position, which I had the honor of holding for 6 years from 2003 to 2009. And this is a very powerful monitoring mechanism, not sufficiently known yet throughout the world, but it's quite powerful in that it not only does country visits and makes recommendations to states, writes annual reports, very significant research reports on relevant issues which are important in the discussion on violence against women. And one of the very, very powerful aspects of this mandate is that it can receive complaints, individual communications from anyone. Now, as we all know, UN system has many complaints mechanisms. The treaty bodies, SDO Convention with the optional protocol, which was adopted in 2000, also strengthened the convention by giving it an additional mandate for receiving complaints and making inquiries into systematic violations. But with SDO, of course, number one, your country has to be a signatory of the convention. Number two, you have to exhaust all national mechanisms in order to be eligible to present a complaint to the committee. This can take a long time because internal mechanisms, as we know, particularly in some countries, can take ages. And by that time, it becomes irrelevant for the person who is suffering. But with the special procedures of which the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women is part of, these constraints do not exist. Anyone from around the world, regardless of whether their country is a party to any convention or not, can send a complaint, and they do not necessarily have to exhaust internal mechanisms. The two can go parallel to one another. So it provides an immediate response. And there are two types of complaints. One is allegation letter, when the rapporteur receives, and it is a fairly substantiated and reliable information, then the rapporteur would send the communications to the state concerned, asking for clarification of the matter. And then there's an urgent appeal mechanism, which means the rapporteur can act to request the state to take immediate action because of imminent danger to the person. And although during the 6 years that I was a rapporteur, I realized that the mechanism is hardly used as much as the more conventional human rights mechanisms, such as torture or freedom on religion and so forth. They receive some hundreds of complaints from around the world. Violence against women rapporteur, on the average, received around 80, maybe a little bit more. So this means we need to really make a point of promoting this mechanism a little bit more, and perhaps at the national level, women's organizations need to work with these mechanisms, whether the violence mechanism or others that may be relevant to their cause, to mobilize victims and those at risk to raise their voices and send their communications to these international mechanisms, through which there is a potential of getting some redress. Of course, the problem here is we're talking about one rapporteur, a huge population in terms of the world population. But what is important with these complaints mechanisms is that at the end of the year, they are confidential, but at the end of the year, without disclosing names of the petitioner, these are published as reports. So they provide an incredible advocacy tool, because states respond this or that way. And NGOs at the national level can really confront their governments and ask for accountability, provided that there is such an environment of such accountability. But the whole human rights area is an area of struggle, isn't it? We need to use every venue possible to voice our problems and also to demand for redress and accountability. And I find the special procedures mechanisms, special rapporteurs, special representatives of the SG, these are all under different names, but basically they operate in the same manner, are very powerful mechanisms. And they set precedents too. An issue that may have gone silent for years, by being picked up by a rapporteur, can gain a new recognition. Similarly, in the treaty bodies, for example, when the optional protocol was adopted of the SDO, one of the first complaints that came concerned a domestic violence issue in Hungary. And we're talking about early 1990s, when these issues were still somewhat taboo. You didn't talk about domestic violence openly, let alone take it to the international level. But this happened. And the committee found the Hungarian government having violated their international obligations. But these are very important developments of recent times. The problems are not, they're not a magical wand. We should not be expecting things to change overnight because there are these mechanisms. But the efforts that went behind them, the whole women's movement that worked so diligently to get these recognized, shows that it is possible, that what was unacceptable to be vocalized yesterday is a legitimate human rights concern today. So I think the number one rule of thumb, I guess, for anyone whose rights are being violated, and a woman in particular who's facing violence, whether in the privacy of the home or in the community. I think it's time that this is not experienced in silence anymore, because silence will perpetuate the problem. And that's how this problem, which is as old as humanity, has come so far, because women were expected to endure oppression in silence. This was an expectation on them. I think we have challenged this expectation. We have not solved the problem yet, but we have broken the silence. I think that's a pretty significant step forward. So speak up, look for ways you can get help. Since these issues have become agenda items in many countries now, there are legislative changes, reforms. Many countries, not all, have either a violence against women law, or they have inserted significant provisions within their criminal codes. So unless you use these national possibilities, legal possibilities, your problem will go unsolved. So I think there's room for using various mechanisms at the national level, regional level, and international level simultaneously. But the key is to speak out and look for help. And hopefully that help becomes organized and effectively available for women in all parts of the world. This is an area we're still not so advanced, I guess. But another key area when you're talking about violence against women, so far there has been a tendency to, on the part of states in particular, to look at it from a very protective perspective, victimization perspective. Let's protect these poor women. This is not the idea. Yes, we need to protect women from violence, but we need to start shifting our minds towards an empowerment approach, because unless women are empowered as autonomous individuals who can stand on their own feet, who have alternatives, they will have to accept the violent environment. What will a woman do if she has no house, no independent income, no family to care for them? Where will she go? It's safer for her to live with the violence at home than to take on this incredible unknown challenge. So I think economic rights of women, which has been neglected because violence has been looked as a victimization issue, has to be reset, because I think it's all in the international normative structure, actually, particularly the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the two covenants that sort of grew out of that: civil, political rights, economic, social, cultural rights. But given the world political order, civil political rights, which were always on the priority of Western world's agenda, gained more prominence. And when you talk about human rights, it almost seems synonymous with civil political rights. But how do we exercise our civil political rights if we do not have the economic means by which to do so? So this is a big debate among feminist scholars, of course. It has been for many, many years. And the whole public-private divide that has often put the private sphere, the sphere of woman, sort of outside of public and political concern. These were areas where women activists, women academics spoke on, did research, and challenged the existing legal system. So today we really have a fairly good understanding of how we can overcome, but implementation still lags far behind. And there are serious constraints today to not only women's rights, which is facing an incredible backlash everywhere, because I think the success that women have achieved in the past 2 decades has provoked backlash from right-wing groups. But the whole human rights discourse and system is being undermined by the security agenda and by rising politics that use culture and religion as their tools and have impose their interpretation of what religion is. So it's a continuing struggle. And everyone, whether at the very individual level, at the grassroots, or more organized levels, have to be vigilant about these matters. There's a very strong emphasis on women's silence. This has been the case, I think, in all societies. Even particularly educated women feel this need to be silent because they see the fault to lie with themselves. They say, I'm an educated woman, I'm middle class. If I'm being violated, that I must be doing something wrong. So the shame really becomes an additional burden on the woman. And in other areas where, particularly societies where young women are expected to be obedient, it can be very deadly, and I mean deadly, to speak out. And as we speak today, there are women who are facing serious repercussions because they have dared to speak out. Gang rapes, we hear about this in the media constantly. So does this mean we stay quiet? I think that's a decision every woman needs to make. But what I can say is that without taking that chance and without speaking up, we will never know whether we can get some help. And it always helps to sort of identify friendly people in our environment whom we can confide in. Things are not all that closed up anymore. I think there is growing awareness everywhere that violence is illegal, that violence is a human rights violation. So try to find allies and find out what legal mechanisms there are at the national level. Still, we hear a lot of stories of women going to the police to complain, and the police would only lecture them and send them back home. This is happening. These are realities. I don't think there is an immediate solution to these, only to say that national and local level women's groups have to work very diligently to address these issues. But it is a risk, yes, it is a risk. But the risk of silence is much greater. It often ends, it can end in death. A lot of women who are beaten up by their partners or husbands or someone else in the family, the end result, the violence does not go away. It only gets bigger. So I think it's a decision that the woman herself needs to make, and she needs to take a step and find where she might be able to get help. And I think there is that possibility today. One thing we learned is that individual resistance can have great risks, whereas collective action is empowerment. And this has been the story of women's movement to begin with, because women individually have always negotiated with patriarchy, have always resisted, but very few of them succeeded in changing the terms of their existence. Many of them were quieted down by harsh methods. But as women joined forces, though it grew into a movement, and this is how we achieved what we have achieved so far. So, and this is a possibility even at the remotest levels. Women can join forces, and it is happening. I have seen good practices here and there. For me, Women's Learning Partnership is precisely this, joining forces. It is not just joining forces to protect ourselves, but to have these stories become normative so that we can advance in making, in the implementation of existing structures for insurance of human rights. So I have noticed that very diverse countries and very diverse women are represented in the partnership. But that sharing of experiences really takes them quite far in terms of learning from one another and actually changing while communicating with one another. So it's a very successful, non-hierarchical way of getting diverse groups of women together and working together. And I hope that this modality now, as WLP aspires, will be replicated at the national levels. And the same thing can draw other women's issues groups within the partner organizations. So it's a good practice in itself, I think, in empowering and women and sharing of experiences.